All right. So delighted to be here with all of you tonight to engage one of my favorite people in conversation, Dr. Zach. Please welcome him.
Beautiful people. Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful people.
Zach, we met a couple years ago.
Yeah.
I remember it vividly. We were at a conference not unlike this, and we had this amazing conversation.
It was completely unlike this.
It was very a friendship was born, and we have gone on to have some of the most meaningful and impactful conversations I've ever had in my life. And so it's a pleasure and an honor to be up here tonight to help share a little bit of that with everybody here. So welcome and thank you.
I'm beyond honored to be here. It's been overwhelming sitting through 2 days of this caliber of human beings, and the whole time thinking you're supposed to follow all of that. It's just really
after
spectacular.
this fair, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
What are we doing up here?
I don't have any music videos in that one.
We can work on that. So Zach is a triple board certified physician, which is a rare thing. Endocrinology and metabolism, internal medicine, and hospice and palliative care. Correct? Did I get that right?
Nailed it.
Yeah. But that's the least of what makes you unusual in my mind. You're a very unconventional medical practitioner. And I'm interested, I think a good place to start would be to walk us through this evolution from being somebody who was reared in the conventional medical school paradigm into what I would characterize as a more of a healer than a doctor.
Yeah, I think seeds are always planted in our lives that we don't necessarily realize what they're planting. I think this last discussion that we just heard with these vignettes of a woman's life, that she recalls these poignant and painful moments, and now here she is, as a source of wisdom for humanity through the collection of these seeds that are planted. And I feel like any of us could tell that same story of our lives. We had these seeds planted, and wisdom comes out of pain, wisdom comes out of loss. Somehow heart opens through heartbreak, all of these weird dichotomies that happen in life. And for me, setting me up for that, what I had no idea that would be a transition from inside the box allopathic pharmaceutical doctor to a quack, that early journey was really around just my nuclear family. I had wonderful parents, incredible mom and dad. Grew up in low-income housing in Boulder. And it's so interesting to remember back what it used to be like a kid. You didn't know what you looked like, right? It's so interesting how bombarded our children are today with what they look like. I mean, they're selfieing all the time. They have this vision of us, but in the late 60s and early 70s, there weren't full-length mirrors, at least not in low-income housing. And so when you're 3 feet tall, you literally don't have access to anything that would give you a reflection of yourself. And so I think I went through this wonderful point of life where I didn't know what I looked like, I just knew what it felt like to be me. And a lot of what shaped that was my mother had intractable seizure disorder, a lot of epilepsy when I was growing up. And so it was not an unusual scenario where we'd be at a grocery store and she'd start having a grand mal seizure, and all the other taller people, you don't even think of yourself as a kid, right? When you're a kid, it's just like you're the short and all these big people around you. And all the big people would start freaking out, and I would just sit down with my mom and put her, sit next to her head and hold her hand or whatever until the seizure. And so that planted a seed in me, I think, of just like this awareness that to be with somebody who's in distress or having a crisis, you just have to be present, and it's a powerful thing. Mm-hmm. And I would see all the big people settle down when I showed them that I wasn't scared and I knew how to take care of my mom when she was having a seizure. That happened, and much more of life kind of unfolded in the years to come that took me way far away from the concept of medicine. I didn't know that I was going to be good at medicine. I consider myself kind of a B+ student, terrible test taker, terrible guesser. Like if it was multiple choice tests, I was always like, I'm going to fail this thing. Hated multiple choice tests. didn't do well with a lot of aspects of school. So I just got into auto mechanics, and so I built cars and tore cars apart with all my buddies, and that was like what I thought I was gonna do. But through one of those seeds planted, first girlfriend when I was very cool, 18 years old or something like that, and his first girlfriend ends up breaking my heart in a number of ways, as if you can really have your heart broken by a girl when you're 18, but when you're 18, you're like, I'm just devastated, and I'm just like blown open, and it's so dramatic. And so in that drama moment, I decided I wasn't gonna go into my engineering program at CU Boulder, and I was gonna go just travel the world and figure myself out kind of thing. And within like minutes of that decision, an aunt called up and was like, do you wanna come to the Philippines and birth babies? And I was like, whoa, that's like totally trippy cool. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. No medical experience. Didn't actually, I had a vague idea what babies were because I was the oldest of 3 kids. I was like, they kind of come out and they turn into siblings, and so I was like, I have some experience. I've like seen 3 of those things grow up.
I've seen a baby.
And I've seen them, yeah. And I hadn't really, I don't think ever really held one. I think maybe I held my littlest brother when he was first born, but got to the Philippines, I was 19, incredible experience, and over those next 6 months, saw some of the most mind-blowing things. I mean, the reality is, none of you would be sitting here right now listening to any of us if you could really wrap your mind around how miraculous you are. There's just no way you would bother listening to anybody, because what could anybody add to that miracle? This woman sitting here, this is beauty. This woman here has 70 trillion cells. And inside every one of those cells is 6 feet of DNA. And if we strung her DNA end to end, this beautiful woman here would wrap around Mother Earth 2 million times. Wrap around Mother Earth 2 million times. And you have been knit together to live the life you've lived, to touch the hands you've touched, to hug the people you've hugged, to kiss the faces you've kissed, and to do what you've done. Who could add to anything like that? We are literal numerical miracles walking around. And I got to see that in the Philippines. And I watched, in the most extreme poverty I'd ever been exposed to, babies being born out of women who had nothing, with such genuine hope and expectation of life. And these tiny little babies, 4-pound babies, you know, they can fit in your hand, and then they go on to thrive. And so all of that planted a seed so that when allopathic medicine came along and said, here's 2,000 diseases, here's 2,000 drugs to treat those diseases, go do it. I went after that. I was going to totally go do that. But when it didn't work, when it started to fail, 8 years in, I had those seeds of remembering to be really a great presence in somebody's life who's suffering and whose brain is totally dysfunctioning. Just be still, silent, and sit next to them. It's enough. Or witness a freaking miracle at any stage of life. Realize that whatever ridiculous training you might have can't add to that. You can only be witness to that. And so that set the stage, and I still had no idea where that was going to take me, but I was willing to start to close the door on the allopathic world, realizing I could study that the rest of my life. I could get 3 more subspecialties, because that's why I got 3 subspecialties. I was looking for truth. I was looking for some solid ground to stand on.
But during this period of time in which you're fully immersed in allopathic medicine, you're practicing within the Western paradigm, diagnose, prescribe, was there a specific incident that made you realize you needed to course correct or change your trajectory? Or was it an evolution over time of what you were seeing on a daily basis? Like, who was coming into your office? What were you seeing? And what triggered you to change this approach to healing in medicine?
It was an evolution, and there was triggers. I think, a couple of those events, I was studying cancer, developing chemotherapy at the time. That was my research world. And then clinically, as an endocrinologist, I was seeing a lot of diabetes, autoimmune disease, and the like. And there was a moment where I was watching under the microscope cancer cells infiltrating healthy tissue. Mm-hmm. And all of you have actually seen this exact image many, many times. All of you have flown so you could get to Nantucket. And when you're flying, and you're flying over a large city, and you see the way in which highways shoot out from the cities, and then we organize housing and infrastructure around that, it is exactly the same shape as a cancer growing into healthy tissue. And so when you see something like Dallas, Texas growing into the nature around it, it looks for all the world as a cancer would grow. Exactly the same thing, following the arterioles of blood supply, nutrients, nervous systems of communication. And so I was staring at this, experiencing this, and then ran over to the clinic and jumped into my white coat, put on a stethoscope so it looked like I knew what I was talking about, and then jumped into this seat. And this guy who I'd never seen before was sitting on the other side. I was like, "Oh, are you in the wrong clinic? I'm Dr. Bush. I don't think I've met you." And he's like, "Well, I just had a really urgent problem." Anyway, he pulls up his pant leg, and he's got this diabetic ulcer in the side of his leg that's just horrible, like just oozing all kinds of horrible, gross stuff. And so I get down in this after a while, get all the equipment together, start debriding and just clearing out this ulcer, just try to get this guy stabilized until he can have a definitive surgery or something like that. And there came a moment when I was scraping away at this healthy tissue, and suddenly there was the exact same image of this necrotic, dead diabetic ulcer sitting in the midst of this healthy tissue, looked exactly like the cancer. And at that moment, suddenly realized, I wonder if we were just calling these things a bunch of different names, and in fact, it's all the same freaking thing. What if there's just lack of healthy tissue, and then you develop disease? And that sounds so freaking obvious, but it was very profound to a mind that had a belief that diseases kind of snuck up on you and infiltrated your system, and you could get infections, or you could get cancer, or you get autoimmune diseases, and they sneak up on you. And the realization that we would make vulnerabilities within our body for these things to come and take up space was just flipped it all on its head.
Yeah, it's almost in a perspective that's rooted in Ayurveda, in that the body has a certain balance that it's trying to strike, and when that balance is out of whack, or certain systems are out of balance, you create the opportunity for certain diseases like this to appear.
Exactly right. And I think that ends up being, you fast forward, my current clinic that I run is called the M Clinic. We picked the letter M because it's the center of all of the spoken and written alphabets as a letter. And so I figured it must represent the balance point of communication. And I had by this time decided that all disease is created, or the opportunity for disease is created, by a lack of communication. And so that we could find a center point of communication around the letter M, and then find out that bizarrely, that sound of is the sound of creation. And so the that we create. And so what if the sound of creation was the center point of communication? And so there are all kinds of fascinating things about that M, in addition to, or one of them being that it's the only letter that represents the masculine and the feminine. And so that's kind of, you just nailed it in that. Ayurveda, 5,000 years of Chinese medicine as well, all of these have been speaking of balance. And there is not a single pharmaceutical drug you can take that puts you into balance. It is an inherently man-made artificial chemical, therefore was able to be patented and turned into a multi-billion-dollar drug. That drug, as it enters your body, is a foreign invader. It's going to create imbalance at every level. It's why every commercial for a drug has to have 15 seconds of disclaimer at the end, spoken very quickly, that says it's going to cause erectile dysfunction, acne, and death, but at least your blood pressure will be good, And so, the reality is we are creating imbalance by looking at human beings as a source of disease rather than a vessel for health.
Right. The difference between the paradigm of diagnose and prescribe a disease model versus the study of what what are the pinnacles of health? Like, what constitutes health with a capital H? So how do you define health?
Health is defined simply at its lowest or most common denominator as fully connected to nature. If a cell is fully connected to its nature and has unfettered access to information, it will forever be healthy. You can injure it all day long, you can give it radiation, and it will repair at an insane rate. Now, and if you got so lucky as to repair it or injure it so badly it couldn't repair itself, it would simply commit suicide through apoptosis, a programmed cell suicide, and in the process call on a stem cell to replace it. It's literally an infinite source of life, is a healthy cell. And then, so health in the end is, are you completely connected to your nature, and do you have unfettered access to information?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's beautifully put. And I think telescoping out from that, I want to get into the relationship between human health and environmental health. Like, we tend to think of human health in isolation, under a microscope, under this sort of binary perspective of scientific inquiry. But much of what you talk about and much of your focus is on looking at the holistic nature of this environment within that we share and within which we live. So talk a little bit about the relationship between environmental degradation and the escalation of some of these chronic illnesses that we're seeing at disproportionate rates right now.
Yeah, to believe this information, we can back up for a moment to a huge topic that's blown up for the last 10 years, which is the microbiome. And the microbiome has become a catchphrase that's even in your, women's journals next to the grocery store line and everything else. You don't have to go to the medical literature anymore to hear about the microbiome. It's really telling because Dove just came out with a soap. Dove, friendly to the microbiome. It's like, if that's what your shampoo bottle says now, that means that we no longer in a scientific description of microbiome. It is now a fad. And so friendly to the microbiome soap is not true. Like that's just not how soap works. Right. And so we can ignore that little fact, but just take it in as the whole population has come to embrace the concept of the microbiome. Unfortunately, neither doctors nor the consumer has any idea what the microbiome really is. It's just a vague sense of, well, there's lots of good bacteria. And the leap forward there was, of course, the probiotic industry, which turns out is a scientific disaster, a medical disaster. It's a $37 billion marketing campaign. There's not good science behind the probiotic industry. But all of that said, at least it broke the door open to the possibility that there was good bacteria out there. Because up until the probiotics, there was this manifest, just belief that all bacteria were bad. And so you saw the burst of antimicrobial everything, right? You had antimicrobial baby wipes, you had antimicrobial alcohol pumps every time you walk into the grocery store. Before you touch that grocery cart, you got an antimicrobial wipe and you're wiping that off. And so we developed, over 120 years, we developed the belief that bacteria were going to attack us and kill us. Bacteria, it turns out, are just the very tip of the iceberg of this thing we call the microbiome. It is the microbial life that creates soil, it creates the air we breathe, it creates the bodies that we thrive in. It certainly, we all have come to understand, constitutes the gut, right? And so the bacteria of your small intestine and colon, but you have bacteria all through your sinuses, through the mouth and oral structures, all over your skin, under your eyelids. But the bacteria, you've got about 20 or 30,000 species on a human body. Some people think it's going to be maybe 40, 50. That's a lot of species. And then you see how many of those species, and you find out that this woman has 70 trillion cells, as pointed out, but she's carrying around 1.5 quadrillion bacteria. That's incredible. But the bacteria are outnumbered another tenfold by parasites. And parasites, there's 300,000 species of. The parasites we fear, and we think, oh, you don't want to get a parasite. You go to India, you're probably going to get a parasite, blah, blah, blah. So we have this concept that parasites are somehow over in India, No, there's 300,000 species of parasite.
They probably are,
yeah.
but
They're certainly
Here
in
too,
India.
yeah.
They just travel through seasonally. But no, there's actually parasites everywhere. And there's these cool little parasites that live under every healthy eyelid that looks a little like a worm with this freaky face on it. And without that guy living under your eyelid, you're actually very prone to disease. And so we have all
well
of this.
tonight,
Yes,
everybody.
yeah. Say something friendly to your eyelid worms tonight. The parasites, again, are outnumbered radically by the fungi. And so we now are estimating around 5 million species of fungi. You go to your Trader Joe's and you see that you got oyster mushrooms and shiitake, you're like, ooh, nice grocery store, 3 species of fungi. Now there's 5 million species of fungi. We're scratching the surface with our culinary adventures. 5 million species of fungi. When you start to really calculate that up, you start to realize how vastly outnumbered the humanity is. We're one species. And Homo sapiens sapiens, we named ourselves wise twice, which I think just is inherently unwise. Like at some point, that seems stupid. Like, at any rate, Homo sapiens sapiens, we decoded our genome and found that there was 20,000 genes. And that's horribly bad news for a wise species, because shortly before we decoded the human genome, we found out that the fruit fly had 13,000 genes. And we had found out that the flea had 30,000 genes. And so to find out the human falls somewhere between a flea and a fruit fly, frankly a little closer to the fruit fly, seemed like we got a real short deck. It's like, we were expecting 280,000 genes, and we had 20. And so this was like 1996, 1998, blew apart the whole concept of genome and DNA, because suddenly we realized we were wrong, because Watson and Crick found the double helix, and we had known what a gene was, and that gene could go on to make one RNA, which would go on to make one protein. And we knew we had 280,000 different proteins, and so surely we had to have enough genes to make all of the human body. And to find out that we were that missing of genomic data sent us back to the drawing board. And suddenly we created this whole new belief of epigenetics. And epigenetics became this understanding that each gene could be manipulated to create different outcomes. Meaning, imagine a blueprint of a house being able to build 200 different houses. And that's exactly how it turns out. And so each gene in your body, you've got 20,000, but each of those can now make over 200 different gene products depending on your environment. And so by 2000, we were starting to realize we are super plastic. And we get these genes from mom, we get these genes from dad, and then from there on out, the ecology plays with them. The ecology is manipulating and moving what you're going to become. If you do the math, each one of you, with the genes that you got from mom and dad, could put out 4 million different variants of you.
Wow.
Depending on your environment.
Yeah.
And then this gets more crazy, because recently we found out that there's 98% of your genome. I mentioned that this woman wraps around Mother Earth 2 million times. It's kind of mind-blowing amount of DNA. That DNA that wraps around Earth 2 million times, 98.5% of it does not code for a gene. And so we very obviously came to the clear conclusion that that was junk DNA. Lots of waste, because when you look out at nature, it's just like 98.5% junk everywhere, just waste, waste, waste. But we didn't know what it was, so we called it junk DNA. And then just in the last couple of years, we find out that that 98.5% of the genome is actually coding for these tiny little nucleotide sequences that we call microRNA now, that do something very crazy for genetic information, is that they leave the cell. And so your genome starts to permeate the space around the cell that had the nucleus that contained this chromosome that held the DNA, and it's now leaking out of that cell. And the microRNA is now permeating your whole body. It got crazier, though, when we realized that the microRNA wasn't even contained to the body, and it could leave in the little vacuoles within the saliva of my mouth, and suddenly it could go airborne in the air that I breathe out. And that microRNA is being breathed in by all of you. And so I have genetically modified every one of you over the last
all GMOs.
hour. You guys are all leaving as GMOs.
Yeah.
Every one of you is a genetically modified organism, and the one having the most influence on you is the one you're swapping saliva with the most. And interestingly, it's not just the human there that's creating that shift. The microRNA go on to determine what genes are going to turn on in these vastly different spaces. And so you could turn on genes different than you would have if I hadn't shown up. And so you're genetically responding to me. And that's fascinating because in that journey, we're realizing I'm 10 to 1 bacteria to human. And if we looked at this woman's bloodstream right now, we'd find out that 40% of the genetic microRNA switches in her bloodstream isn't even human. It's bacteria, fungi, and the microbiome's information, turning this woman into somebody different. And so that's where we ran into this collision of moments that you just asked about, which is as we destroy ecology, and we find out that ecology is modifying the human genome, there's got to be a crisis point where the human genome can no longer produce intelligent health, and we run into this 0 point of destruction of biology on the planet, and a great extinction occurs.
Yeah, to ground this in the themes of TNP, connectivity, community, communication, at a very top level, you're dealing with these very same subject matters on the micro level. So when we consider the fact that we are much more microorganism than we are human, that we are breathing out this RNA, and we are literally connecting ourselves to our community in a very unconscious way, I think for me what that does is it helps me to realize that we're not as sentient as we think we are, and that our survival and our ability to thrive is so deeply interconnected to everything that surrounds us. And I've heard you speak about treating patients with all the right things, lifestyle, diet, et cetera, and not getting results, and coming to this conclusion that the reason you weren't seeing these results was because the food was being sourced from soil that was depleted. And the point being that we cannot isolate ourselves out of our environment and treat these conditions in isolation. We have to consider everything in the whole. And disease is a function of a lack of communication and connectivity. And the journey towards health is what we've been speaking about all weekend, which is about embracing community and growing closer to not just our environment, but the people that we love and the new people that we're bringing into our lives. And this is what is happening on a cellular level.
That's exactly accurate, I believe. I think it's fascinating to think that here we are, each of you sitting next to each other are genomically enriching one another. You're changing each other genetically. And so there's an invisible communication network going on in this room that doesn't happen on a Zoom conference, that doesn't happen across a Twitter feed. And so it's interesting to think as we digitize human communication, we're losing genetic swapping. We're becoming genetically isolated as human beings as we lose touch, as we lose face-to-face communication. By the way, every time I talk to you for a couple hours, I always try to go run faster the next day because I just hope I breathed in the right RNA.
On the subject of human touch, who here has received a hug from Zach over the last couple days? He's a pretty amazing hug. Yeah, he likes to hug for a long time, but go ahead.
It's my version of highway robbery. Yeah. Like, I'm just like genomically sucking you in, and you're like, that's a long hug. I'm like, that's a really freaking short genetic infusion. No, that's really good stuff. So communicating by touch is interesting. But it gets really weird now that we're looking beyond the genomics now. Let's go into a human gut. And so this woman here, another beautiful woman. It's really nice to be arrayed around a round stage with beautiful people all around. I got to say this is a really unique thing because oftentimes you're looking at lights and you just see a dark audience. So thank you for whoever designed this room. This is the most beautiful speaking experience I've had just because I can see each of you so well. This woman has an intestinal membrane. All of you do. This isn't supposed to be like a gross thing about her. She has an intestinal membrane that covers 2 tennis courts in surface area. And it looks like a coral reef. And so if we put all of your intestines together, I'm really big into macro examples because just most of these things don't make any sense on the micro level. But if we put all of your intestinal linings together right now, we could cover that entire bay in human intestine. And it's a fascinating coral reef that looks just like a coral reef with all these fingers that ornately reach out to suck nutrients out of the ocean. You're sucking nutrients out of the food that you just ingested in the last couple hours, and you're becoming enriched by this experience. And your colon is sucking water. Your colon's sole job is to suck water out of your nutritional input. That's fascinating. So the water is just as important, if not the most important part of consumption of nutrients. So you eat a cucumber and you absorb all those micronutrients from the small intestine, and then the water from that cucumber is sucked in by the colon, and you end up with this hyper-intelligence that's been sucked out of there. Because along that journey, the microbes have changed every nutrient, changed the whole experience. And what we're now finding as we're getting better and better doing microimaging of the gut lining is that the neurons that innervate that 2 tennis courts in surface area have to be so numerous, for one part. The number of nerves in a single human intestinal lining constitutes the size of a dog's brain. And so it's a massive neural center that is your gut. And so this whole concept that every woman knows is the way to a man's brain is through his stomach is actually, no, that is his brain. Like, it's not like through there you get to the brain, like that's the brain. And so you get to the brain, and it's so interesting how fast that happens because we've now been able to image that the human neurons are reaching up to the intestines largely to get serotonin and dopamine. Serotonin we think of as being this brain neurochemical, but it turns out that 90% of the serotonin made in the human body is made in the gut lining by enteric endocrine cells. They're little ghostbuster-looking green globules that are there, and they're cranking out serotonin, and the nerves reach up and grab all of that information. And then we just found out, just in the last couple of years, that your enteric endocrine system can't make serotonin if you don't have the right bacteria sitting on top of that human cell. And so it takes a bacteria to inform a human endocrine cell to make the neurons to go into the brain. But then it got weirder that UCSF just showed that the brain actually sends neurons past the gut lining itself right into the shit. Like, it's just so bizarre. Like, you're now thinking shit all the time. You're just like encased in this milieu of great poop and the origins of life you can imagine there. Thousands of species of bacteria and fungi and parasites and nutrients composting at high speeds, and your brain wanted to know what the hell was going on there, so it just grew neurons into that. At the same time, same journal actually published that the ion channel in the surface of those particular neurons are totally different than the ion channels in the brain. They actually the human neuron designed its ion channels to mimic the design of the ion channels on the surface of the bacteria in your gut. What I'm describing is, you asked, what is this Nantucket Project version of human anatomy as we now understand it? And the answer is, the neighborhood is not human. The neighborhood is hundreds of thousands of species with a genome that's so much more vast than ours and a neurochemistry that's active straight to our brain. As we start to study the brain more and more, we realize there is no center of memory for long-term memory in the human brain. Totally bizarre. If the brain doesn't store your long-term memory, where is that stored? Okay, so you got a hard drive somewhere. You've got some RAM. The hippocampus is this tiny little area of the brain that acts as that short-term memory stick of the computer. But where the hard drive sits, nobody knows. And so, I mean, I do, obviously, but most people don't. And so you've got this situation where you realize this is just the central processing unit. It's not the hardware of... And the CPU chip of your computer, the CPU has never written a term paper or a book. Interesting that the CPU chip in your computer has actually never created a piece of data or information. All it is the central processing unit. The brain looks to be only a central processing unit. It can't have a taste, it can't have a smell, it can't have a thought, it can't have anything. It's just the CPU chip. It then sends out wires, and so you've got sitting on your desk a keyboard, which did write the term paper. No, keyboard has never written a term paper. The keyboard just sits there until somebody comes and types a thought into that keyboard, and then all of those digital signals go to the CPU chip and process that, and now you can print something. We're now finding out that the fingers typing on your keyboard are not human fingers. The microbiome is literally typing on a 2 tennis court surface area keyboard to tell your brain what's going on and what it should think.
I feel like that should depress me. I don't know how to take that information, but what I gather...
You don't have a thought.
Yeah.
You're waiting for the microbiome.
We're supposed to switch seats here, right? Let's do that. Let me wrap my head around what you just said. As we
walk around, do a little thing.
Oh, no on the audio? Okay, cool. What I take from that is that we are less human than we would like to believe that we are. I know there are studies that track the relationship between the nature of our microbiome and the foods that we crave, or the impulses that we entertain. And these are things that we like to think we're consciously creating or unconsciously creating, but which are innately human. And to discover that they are not begs the question of the nature of consciousness itself, right? From whence does consciousness arise? And is human consciousness something that can be characterized or defined as individuated, or is it something more pervasive and elusive that has its roots and its nature in this community of microorganisms that permeates all?
I think you just nailed it.
I'm asking you a question.
I think you just nailed it. I'm so intrigued by that, right? So isn't it so typical of a species that calls itself Homo sapiens sapiens to then coin the term human consciousness? As if the CPU chip ever wrote the paper, right? As if the human brain would ever create consciousness. I really, at this stage of, especially in my hospice work, it's the most obvious. At this second birth that we have, which is often termed death, which is really bad PR management for that. Better marketing for death is definitely rebirth. And the longer you do hospice work and the more times you get to sit at the bedside of somebody who's in this transformation event, the last transformation they get to do in this body, they're now doing in front of your eyes. And they do some crazy, wonderful stuff. They will say some of the most profound stuff you've ever heard. They will say some of the most vulnerable things you've ever heard. And they will definitely bring to clarity the value that their life has had, regardless of how worthless they thought their life was up until that moment. During that transformation, they see value in their life, and you see it all stripping away. And it's at the moment that their neurochemistry is literally shutting down. Their brain is failing, and at that moment, they light you up with this consciousness, this conscious awareness that's just blindingly cool. This moment of clarity only coming when they let go of their firmly held belief system that is human, their firmly held beliefs of their roles and their purpose in their community, and the identity that they've allowed that world to create for them finally starts to inevitably fall apart as the neurochemistry and the heart starts to fail and everything's shutting down, and that's when they get the most clarity they've ever had.
And how do you characterize that clarity? What is that clarity?
It is consciousness at its raw state. The human is dissolving and the consciousness is just there. It's been there the whole time, but the human can you imagine what we do as parents? Can you imagine what we do as a society? These infants are born out of this infinite potential of life, and they come springing out with 70 trillion cells and connected to some sort of soul that has a purpose, that's picked this path and picked their whole journey is laid out before them. And then within minutes, we start programming them. We start deprogramming them of truth and beauty and the miracle fact that they're alive, and start tagging them with information. I'm your dad. You believe you're a dad until you have a second kid. And then you're suddenly like, I have nothing to do with this thing. My son was like so radical when he was born. I was just like, he literally freaked us out. Like, he came out with his hands crossed like this and eyes wide open. And he's like already wiser than I was, and I was pretty young when I had him. Like, I like to tell people I was like 4 when I had him, because he's 21 now and it freaks me out. But now I watch him go from that to the human being he is, and he's got this preternatural like age to him from the day one. And then I have my daughter, and she's just like this like bundle of joy, just like enthusiasm, joy, wants to talk about nothing terribly serious, and doesn't want to get too deep on anything, but wants to just be a source of joy for the world. That's when you realize the only thing I can do as a parent is really screw this thing up, because I don't know where this thing came from, and I don't know where it's heading, and I have no idea why it showed up. And so at that point, you should really take this massive dose of humility and just be like, I just need to create some safe space around this thing to the best of my ability. And I'm just gonna like try to feed it a couple times a day. I'm just gonna stand back and see what happens, because I can't do much more help to that. And that technique has worked pretty well. So I call it kind of like unparenting. There's unschoolers, but just unparent, just stay out of the way. And these things come out. And then it takes them a whole freaking lifetime to realize that they're not a son, they're not a daughter, they're not an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent or an employee or a boss or a CEO or a garbage man or whatever thing. We layer this up, and then it takes a whole lifetime to start to try to drill down through all those layers of human that we put on top of raw miracle. And the consciousness that's sitting there that whole time, I think, is just begging for attention. And all of us get those conscious moments. The poets that have shared with us this week, you guys are tapping into consciousness. And it's not human. It's not human. You say things that are too trippy to be human. You're more alien than you are human. We should talk about aliens another time. It's a good subject. But right now we're in the microbiome, and so you start to realize consciousness
still on the microbiome?
sitting there. Yeah. Well, you gotta stay rooted right where you're at. So you gotta stay in the soil, stay in the dirt. You gotta stay in the shit. And so the microbiome is always there to inform the consciousness until human behavior comes along to inflict itself on the microbiome. And we started doing this in the late 1800s. So Louis Pasteur became famous for pasteurization. And so we started pasteurizing our food to kill all the bacteria in the food, was the idea in the late 1800s. Of course, now you can't buy almonds that haven't been pasteurized. It's ridiculous. Like, we try to annihilate all bacteria. And when we do that, we wipe out the consciousness that would be programming your brain. And so as we load the food system with antimicrobials, herbicides in particular, and we grow an entire food system that is steeped in a chemical herbicide, pesticide environment, as soon as you eat a piece of food now, in fact, you don't have to eat food anymore. We've so infiltrated the ecology with herbicides and pesticides, primarily Roundup, #1 chemical worldwide as far as I'm concerned, somewhere around 4.5 billion pounds when roughly last counted in 2015. So we were doubling that rate every 6 years. And so maybe we're between 4.5 and 6 billion pounds of this chemical, which is patented as an antibiotic, not as a weed killer. And we pour that antibiotic into the soils, and it happens to be water soluble. And so it gets sucked up in the water systems of our planet, and we start to see it evaporated in the air. Now 75% of the air we breathe in the United States is contaminated with Roundup, the air we breathe. And then it gets up in a cloud and it rains back down. 75% of the rain we soak in is contaminated with Roundup. And so it's raining on us, we're breathing it. What does that mean for the whole system? It means that the microbiome is being crushed. It's crushed in the air that we should be breathing. It's crushed at the soil level. It's crushed in the microbial environment. It's crushed in your gut. The ramifications for human consciousness, if we're going to call it that, are pretty significant. We now know that one course of antibiotics for a urinary tract infection in a woman will increase her risk of major depression by 24% in the next 12 months. If she goes back into the doctor's office within that year and gets a second course of antibiotics, maybe for bronchitis, she now has a 54% increase in likelihood of major depression in the next 12 months. 2 courses of antibiotics. Risk of anxiety and panic attack goes up by 17% with 1 course, 44% with 2 courses of antibiotic. If you destroy the microbiome, your sense of connectivity to the world around you disappears. Loneliness literally results from an antibiotic exposure. And I want you guys to be aware of this next time somebody whaps you with an antibiotic. Pay attention. I want you to feel what it feels like to disconnect from the environment around you. Because a moment before that, if you'd gotten it last year, you would have just thought, I'm depressed now. But now you go in consciously and you get that experience, you say, I'm not depressed, I'm just disconnected. I'm just lonely. I just got isolated. Now it's not your problem. Now this isn't a character flaw. Depression is the result of isolation, loneliness at the cell level, disconnect from the microbiome, and isn't it amazing? We find out the same thing about cancer. Cancer, we now understand, is the result of a disconnect from the microbiome, and it's very specific. We now know if you miss these bacteria in the gut, you're going to get breast cancer. You lose these bacteria, you're going to get colon cancer. Lose these, you get lung cancer. The microbiome is programming our consciousness, but it also is the communication network of cellular repair itself. And so as you delete out with the antimicrobial world we live in, delete out the microbiome, isolation is inevitable. I believe we have created the phenomenon of Facebook and the phenomenon of Twitter and the rest as an antidote to antibiotics and the isolation that resulted from them. We would have never seen the reason to connect through a damn cell phone when we can simply look up at the person across the table and talk. But now you see kids. It's not unusual to see a group of 16 kids outside, and these girls won't even look at their friends they're with, and they're Snapchatting the girl that's right in front of them. That's how isolated and lonely she feels. She has, relying on this insane amount of technology in her hand to make this little human connection of looking somebody in the eye. Bless the person who said, look each other in the eye yesterday or whenever that was. What a beautiful neurochemical event happens when we look each other in the eye. And so we see cancer as the endpoint of isolation. A cancer cell has become so isolated and lonely in its existence that it doesn't even know that the rest of the organism has survived. It thinks it's the last semblance of life in the organism. And the only thing it can do now, because it's so damaged it can't repair, the average cancer cell has 20,000 unrepaired genetic injuries in it. I mentioned we only have 20,000 genes. So there's just injuries all over the genome of a cancer cell. It can't repair itself. So the last semblance of life that it can do is divide. And so it just starts dividing. And it divides and divides, just saying life is more important than anything else. I find it fascinating that a cell that thinks everything else around it has died, and it's so injured that it cannot repair, still has a drive for life. You are
But it's going to take everyone else down with it.
It doesn't know that.
In the same way that a damaged human
right?
being might, who is disconnected and depressed and isolated and lonely.
And then we damn that guy who climbs the tower in Vegas and shoots 250 strangers because he's the cancer cell at the macro level. He's so isolated that he doesn't even understand he's part of a larger organism called Homo sapien. He doesn't understand that he's not alone. And he thinks he just needs to have an emotional experience. And so he's creating this through a violent outpouring. This kid who walks into the elementary school and starts shooting his classmates is trying to induce an experience in his body to just experience something because it is so numb in its isolation. It is so quiet and silent and isolated and lonely in its isolation. And so imagine if you walked in with a new diagnosis of breast cancer and the doctor just wrapped you up in a giant fucking hug and said, "You are extraordinarily beautiful. You are made out of the fabric of life itself. You are drive for life at the fabric level, and now there's this tiny little one cell out of your 70 trillion cells that got so lonely and isolated that it forgot or doesn't know that you still are here. And it still wants you to be alive, and so it's going to start dividing at all costs. It's going to try to stay alive. And now we just need to let that cell know that it's part of a greater community. We need to let it plug back in. We need to reconnect that human cell, and it will stop being a cancer cell.
Wow.
And that's exactly what we see out of the microscope.
Yeah.
When you take a human cell and you add back the communication network of the microbiome, we extract these little communication molecules. They're literally, we had the great description of silicone today, and what the heck is Silicon Valley and all of this. That description of silicone melted down sand into that ore, and it's sliced thin, and then we create microchips and everything else. Turns out that the bacteria and the fungi are making, at the molecular level, a silicone base. They're making these tiny little carbon, and not silica in this case, it's carbon matrix that can pass electrons through vast distances. They build liquid circuit boards across biology so that it can communicate and do brilliant, hyper-intelligent stuff. This is what we call quorum sensing in the microbiome world, where a single bacteria growing in a petri dish doesn't do anything much intelligent. It just eats and kind of poops out some metabolites and just grows and splits and splits. But suddenly, when it starts to sense that the community is at its proper maximum number, as it fills the petri dish, it sends out a global signal that says, we're full, and everything they all stop proliferating. They don't overcrowd. And they suddenly start acting as a hyper-intelligent being. And the quorum starts to do things that you would never expect from a single bacteria. And this is what we see happening as you reconnect a cancer cell. It suddenly realizes it's part of a 70 trillion celled quorum, and it literally does this silent suicide moment. It just apoptoses. It says, oh, thank God, Zach's still here.
Down.
Zach's still here. My God, I thought he was dead. I'm so glad he's alive. That's fucking beautiful. I'm just going to go to sleep now. I was so damaged. I was so freaking tired to begin with. I'm just so damaged. I'm this old, vulnerable cell. I'm so glad Zach's good. I'm going to kill myself. So it goes through this apoptosis thing. And of course, I do need another kidney cell. So the stem cell comes in and makes me a new kidney cell there. I never knew I even had cancer. But the microbiome reconnected that cancer cell. And how does it reconnect it? Through this matrix, this liquid circuit board of intelligence that's made by the microbiome. And so now we have to zoom forward for a moment, because I gotta leave you guys all with some really depressing news. And I apologize that. But all of this sounds like an interesting thought experiment. All of this so far sounds like, oh, that's kind of weird and mind-blowing. I will never be able to communicate any of that he just said to anybody I know, and that's too bad, because it sounded kind of cool. But I want to tell you what we've done to the microbiome, and as the liquid circuit board collapsed, I want you to tell you where Homo sapiens sapien is right now, because we've gotten pictures of it all weekend. As our First Nation people sitting in the back here have told us, their peoples are dying of suicide at an extreme rate. The cancer cells of an isolated human being, when it commits suicide, is a graceful event. It is them saying, I'm the cancer cell, I'm so damaged, I cannot repair anymore, I'm so hurt, I'm going to get out of the way for the rest of humanity. That's an isolated, should-be cancer cell, but instead of going and doing a school shooting, it says, I'm just going to get out of the way. I'm going to commit suicide. We've been talking about suicide here tonight and throughout the weekend. Anybody who has lost somebody to suicide, I want you to know that that person was trying to do what they thought was the most graceful exit they could. They were trying to get themselves out of the way for life to happen. They had lost track. They were so disconnected. And I know that it was a selfish act and it devastated everybody else around them, and I know all of that. But just know that it was the most altruistic thing that they could do from that position of damage and loneliness. In a very bizarre way, suicide is a scream for love into the universe around us. It isn't, I love you, even though I can't love you, or I love you so much that I'm going to get out of the way. That's the mentality of this cell and I want you to know the state of where we are so that we can start to tap into consciousness and lose the concept and the hubris of human consciousness and just start to see consciousness rising on the planet. We have so devastated through our farming and agricultural and medical systems as they have collided with their antimicrobial behavior. We have so destroyed biology on Earth at its core level now that 1 in 30 children are now born with, or moving into, shortly after birth, they will have an autism injury. 1 in 30 children. That number is irrelevant to the human experience, but I'll tell you that in 1975, the year before we created Roundup, before we started infiltrating the entire soil system of the Earth with an antimicrobial, 1 in 5,000 children had autism. 1 in 5,000 in 1975 to 1 in 30 today. The steepest climb in this autistic curve didn't happen in the 70s when we maybe weren't quite as aware of the condition because 1 in 5,000 kids had it. The steepest is happening right now. We are doubling our rates of autism every 3 years. We are now at 1 in 30. We will be at 1 in 15 by the mid-2020s here. We are on track to have 1 in 3 children in the United States with an autism spectrum disorder by 2035, which sounds a long ways off to most of our brains, but that's 15 years. 2 more American presidents, and we could have 1 in 3 children with autism. At the same rate, we have seen 5x of ALS, MS, celiac disease, and then the other neurodegeneratives that we see going in the elderly. Parkinson's in males, Alzheimer's in women. 5x in the last 15, 20 years. We are becoming so disconnected that biology is literally collapsing beneath our feet. My team from our lab was just talking to the EPA a couple weeks ago, and we were showing them data that is so freaking damning to Roundup. We have shown them that, and this isn't just my lab, we were presenting all the data, but a lot of university labs have been doing this work to show that if you inject a mouse or a rodent with a little bit of Roundup, about the amount you would see in a couple days of nutritional consumption, you inject it under their skin, they live a totally normal life, they don't have any injury from it. And so it must be a super safe compound. Just inject it right under the skin, right into their bloodstream, they're fine. But then if you follow their pups, the next generation is suddenly struck with massive obesity, immune dysfunction, and metabolic collapse. Lots of stuff happening in the second generation. No Roundup injury to that generation. They just are back now 1 generation in. The 3rd generation is born, stillborn, severe birth defects, or cancer within the first few months of life. The 3rd generation of Roundup babies, we really saturated our food system in 1996. And so 24 years is kind of the full generation. And so you can see by 2015, we see the 2nd generation being born. Of course, in that journey, we were already seeing this explosion of obesity and autoimmune disease and everything we saw in the mice. But the 3rd generation will be born in this next few years. The 3rd generation of humans born into the Roundup era are upon us. They will look, as the experiments have all played out, as the most damaged and injured population we've ever seen. We are on the verge of the biggest Holocaust that will ever happen to the human species. 7 billion people will be witness to 1 in 3 children with autism, 70 to 80% of our adults with cancer at that moment, and the highest rates of infertility ever seen. We've lost 57% of sperm counts in all Western countries in just 40 years. Sperm counts have dropped by 57%. 1 in 3 males is now infertile by sperm count in Western nations. If we do that one more time, we will reach an extinction level of 90-95% infertility, crippled with the diseases I've laid out for you. What I just gave you is an apology to this woman for being such a pain in the ass, and I'm still talking.
Yeah.
You're doing your job really well.
We do have to round this up, and this is quite a dystopian picture that you're painting for us right here. And I would like to let everyone go tonight feeling a little bit hopeful about the future. So I know you have words that you could share on that as well. So maybe we could pivot a little bit here and land the plane on a high note, Zach.
You have an advocate. You guys have an advocate in your midst. Thank you, Rich. Thank you all for your patience. And get up and leave, no problem, no offense at all. If it wasn't the survival of our species, I wouldn't be torturing you in those uncomfortable chairs right now. But what I just gave you, what I just told you, is humanity has a terminal disease. And as your hospice doctor right at the moment, I would like to tell you, you have the best opportunity you've ever had in your life to become the most human you've ever been. If we as a human species step into this moment and drop all of the stories we've been telling each other, some great stories this weekend. It's important to tell our story, it's important to know our history, but we don't transform. We don't really evolve past our story. We can be defined by our story. We cannot transform and evolve past our story until we let go of it completely. I just told you the story of humanity as it's been written. We could believe that story and we could just live by that and it will fall out just as we've talked. Or we could acknowledge the story and say we're going to let go of our identity, we're going to let go of our belief systems, we're going to let go of our behaviors, and we're going to be willing to be a completely new blank canvas to planet Earth itself. Because in the end, what I have told you tonight is human consciousness is not at all human. Humanity, I believe, is at the center point of all of life on Earth for the reason that we've been given the opportunity to be the CPU chip for the planet. Mother Earth is rising again in an extraordinary moment of extinction. Every 20 minutes, another species goes extinct. Every 20 minutes. We've lost 40% of biology on Earth in the last 50 years. We're almost halfway done with this great extinction. And you showed up right the frick now. 7 billion people showed up right now at the tipping point of 200,000 years of Homo sapien to be a fresh canvas. And the leaders among us will be the autistic children. Because when an autistic kid is supported back to health, that kid can never be programmed with the current paradigm. They refuse. They don't even have the right wiring to accept it. And so I am asking every one of you to look deep into yourself and become as autistic as possible tonight. Stop believing what the world wants you to feel and feel real tonight. Because in that, if you are willing to really feel what it's like to be human right now, you will feel agony, you will feel pain, you will feel isolation, you will feel loneliness, and you will feel unbelievable hope. And you will feel unbelievable love percolating up through Mother Earth herself, which is saying, wake up. You're on hospice, you've got 6 months to live. You have a terminal diagnosis that cannot be cured. And so you need to let that body die and become something new. And so each of you will participate in the biggest transformation event that has ever happened when you completely let go of who you think you are today. And talk to the people who you love next to you and say, will you please bargain with me today? Will you please sit down and brainstorm with me today on how we can be a completely different relationship tomorrow? I would like to have a completely different relationship with you, Rich, tomorrow. I would like to just forget that we've ever done podcasts together. I would like to just let all of those stories that have caught people's attention before and just look you deeper into your experience in your soul and say, what could we create bigger? What could we create cleaner than what we've told before? Because you and I are more beautiful than we know. And you and I could create something more beautiful indeed in just our love for one another. And we could just let all of the beliefs, what if you weren't Rich Roll at all? What if we stopped calling you Rich? What if you stopped seeing me as Zach? And what if we just said, holy human being, you are so glorious. Thank you for being with me. Thank you for sharing this evening with me. I would like to finish it with another hug.
We could do that. I'm game for that. Zach Bush, everybody. Thank you.